She wasn't looking for love. She had everything a woman is supposed to want: the career, the apartment with the skyline view, a calendar full of admirers, a life that looked, from the outside, completely finished. What she didn't have was the one thing she never thought to look for, because he'd been standing next to her the entire time, so close and so constant that she'd stopped being able to see him clearly at all. This is the story of a woman named Elena Hart, and the best friend who loved her for 11 years before he ever said a word out loud. But this isn't just a love story. Somebody didn't want this to happen. Somebody was willing to lie, to manufacture evidence, to quietly reshape the truth just enough to keep two people apart. And by the time that truth finally surfaced, Elena would have less than 3 hours to decide whether she was actually brave enough to fight for the life she wanted, or whether she'd let it board a plane without her. By the end of this video, you're going to ask yourself the same question Elena asked herself the night everything fell apart. How do you know the difference between someone who loves you and someone who just can't stand to lose? Stay until the end, because the answer isn't what you think, and neither is the ending. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 4 questions are going to follow you through this entire story. Why did it take 11 years for two people who clearly loved each other to admit it? Who was willing to destroy that love rather than watch it happen? What price would each of them have to pay to protect it? And when the clock finally ran out, would Elena be brave enough to chase what she actually wanted? Or would she let the silence win, the way it almost had for 11 years already? Keep those questions in your mind, because nothing in this story is as simple as it looks. Elena and Jake met when she was 11 and he was 9, 2 houses apart, on a quiet street in Ohio lined with maple trees that turned the whole block orange every October. Despite the 2 years between them, they ended up in the same class at school that year. Elena had started school a little late as a child, so by the time she was 11, she was sitting one desk away from a boy 2 years younger who happened to live 2 doors down. She was the girl who organized everyone's games, who could turn a boring Saturday into a kingdom with rules and stakes and a plot. He was the quiet kid 2 doors down with a disposable camera his grandfather had given him, always a few steps behind the group, always noticing things other people missed, the way the light hit the creek at a certain hour, the way Elena's whole face changed when she was about to win an argument. The first thing Jake ever said to her, standing awkwardly at the edge of her 11th birthday party, holding a present he was too shy to hand over, was, "You have cake on your face." She didn't. He just wanted an excuse to talk to her. It didn't work particularly well. She wiped her face, said thanks, and went back to her friends. But he tried again the next day, and the day after that, riding his bike past her house at a suspiciously consistent hour, until eventually trying stopped being necessary. They became just Elena and Jake, the way certain names fuse together on a street where everyone's known everyone since kindergarten. There's a memory Elena still returns to sometimes, from when she was 13. Her parents were going through a divorce that year, the kind that didn't involve screaming, but involved a silence in the house that was somehow worse, and Elena spent most evenings that spring sitting on Jake's back porch instead of her own, not talking about it, just existing somewhere that didn't feel like it was quietly falling apart. Jake never asked her to explain. He'd just show up with 2 popsicles from the freezer and sit next to her until she was ready to talk, or wasn't, and either way was fine with him. Years later, she'd tell people that Jake taught her, before she was even old enough to understand what he was teaching her, what it felt like to be around someone who didn't need anything from you in order to stay. The summer she was 16, they both got jobs at the same ice cream shop downtown, Elena at the register, Jake scooping, and it was, by Elena's own later admission, one of the best summers of her life, though she wouldn't have said why if you'd asked her then. It was Jake who was there the night her first real boyfriend, a boy named Marcus from her chemistry class, broke up with her in the parking lot after a movie, right in front of everyone. Jake didn't say much. He just drove her home the long way, past the lake, windows down, letting her cry and then eventually laugh about how dramatically the boy had delivered the line, "I think we want different things," like he'd rehearsed it in a mirror. Jake made fun of the line so precisely, in such a dead-on impression, that Elena laughed until she couldn't remember why she'd been crying in the first place. That was, by her own account decades later, the first time she caught herself thinking, half-consciously, that she wished more boys were like Jake, without ever letting the thought finish the sentence it was actually trying to say. The truth was, Jake fell for her for real at 14, at a bonfire on the edge of the lake, watching her tell a ridiculous story with her whole body, laughing so hard she nearly fell into the fire pit herself. He never told anyone, not his friends, not his sisters, and certainly not Elena, because Jake had run the numbers 1,000 times in his head, and every version ended the same way. If I tell her and she says no, I lose her completely. And losing Elena, even as just a friend, was a risk he could never quite justify. Not at 14, not at 17, not at 22, not at 31. There was one night, at 17, when he almost did it anyway. It was prom night. Elena had gone with someone else, a boy named Trevor who Jake privately thought was an idiot with good hair. And around 11 o'clock, Trevor disappeared to go drink beer in a parking lot with his friends, and Elena, in her pale blue dress, sat down next to Jake on the curb outside the gym and said, "This is the worst night of my life. Take me somewhere that isn't here." So he did. They ended up at a 24-hour diner, eating pancakes at midnight in prom clothes, and for about 4 minutes, sitting across from her in a vinyl booth under fluorescent light, Jake actually opened his mouth to tell her the truth. And then Elena said, laughing, syrup on her thumb, "You're literally the only person I could ever do something this stupid with." And Jake heard the word only and translated it exactly the way a scared 17-year-old translates everything, as proof that he was safe in the friend category and nowhere else. So he closed his mouth, ordered more pancakes, and told himself it wasn't the right time. He would tell himself that same sentence for the next 14 years. There was a second almost moment in college. At 19, at a party neither of them was particularly enjoying, when Elena, 3 drinks in, had leaned her head on his shoulder and said quietly, "I don't know why nobody I date ever feels like this. Easy, like I don't have to perform." Jake sat very still, terrified that moving even slightly would break whatever this was, and said nothing at all, which Elena, half asleep against his shoulder, took as comfortable silence, and which Jake, wide awake and screaming internally, took as the closest he'd ever come to a sign, immediately followed by the closest he'd ever come to losing his nerve completely. There was a third moment, too, one Jake never told anyone about, not even Elena, until years later. It happened the week Elena called off her wedding to Alex. Jake had driven to her apartment right after that 4 a.m. phone call ended, not because she'd asked him to, but because he couldn't stand the idea of her sitting alone in an apartment full of unopened wedding gifts. He sat on her couch until sunrise while she cried, and slept, and woke up, and cried again, and somewhere around 6 in the morning, watching her finally fall asleep on the other end of the couch, exhausted and makeup smudged and more honestly herself than he'd seen her in months, Jake thought, with a clarity that frightened him. This is the only place I have ever wanted to be. He didn't say it. He made her coffee instead, and left before she woke up, and told himself, once again, that this wasn't the moment, that a woman crying over a broken engagement didn't need her best friend adding one more complicated feeling to the pile. He was right about the timing. He was wrong about how many more years he'd let pass before trying again. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He waited. He dated other women, real relationships, some of them serious, spanning years at a time, and every single one of them eventually arrived at some version of the same conclusion. Sarah, who he dated for almost 2 years in his mid-20s, finally said it outright the night she ended things. "I've met your family. I've met your friends. I've never once felt like I met all of you. There's a room in there you keep locked, and I don't think it has anything to do with me." Jake didn't argue with her. He knew exactly which room she meant, and he knew exactly whose name was written on the door. 2 years after Sarah, a woman named Priya's college roommate, Nina, dated Jake for almost a year, and put it more bluntly on her way out the door. "You're a wonderful boyfriend to everyone, except whoever it is you actually want. I hope she's worth it, because I definitely wasn't the assignment." Jake never told her she was right. He didn't have to. She already knew. Elena, meanwhile, built a life. She moved to Chicago at 22, clawed her way up through 2 agencies working nights and weekends until her portfolio spoke louder than her resume, and at 29, started her own branding firm with nothing but a laptop, a client list of 3, and a level of stubbornness her mother used to call exhausting, and now, watching the firm grow into a 14-person office 5 years later, called impressive. She fell in love twice in those years. The first, a photographer's assistant named David, ended quietly after 8 months, mostly because neither of them fought hard enough for it to survive their first real disagreement. A fight about something so small, neither of them could remember it a year later, except that it revealed how little either of them had actually wanted to work for the relationship. The second, and far more serious one, was with a man named Alex Kane. Alex was, by every conventional measure, exactly what Elena thought she wanted. Successful, driven, ambitious in a way that mirrored her own. The kind of man who made her parents visibly relax when she brought him home. They got engaged after 2 years, in front of friends and champagne, and exactly the kind of proposal that photographs well. Elena spent the 8 months of wedding planning that followed, telling herself the stress she felt was normal, that everyone gets overwhelmed by seating charts and caterers, that this was just what commitment looked like from the inside. It wasn't until the night she found herself spending 3 hours more genuinely excited about finalizing which centerpiece to choose, actually engaged, actually present, than she'd been about anything involving Alex himself in weeks, that she let herself admit what she'd been avoiding. 2 weeks before the wedding, sitting across from him at their own kitchen table, she called it off. Alex did not take it well. He told her, in a voice she'd never heard him use before, that she was making the biggest mistake of her life, that she'd regret it, that nobody would ever love her the way he had. Elena spent that night on the phone with exactly one person, the way she always did, and Jake stayed on the line until 4 in the morning, not saying much, just staying. Through every version of her life, the moves, the jobs, the 2 almost loves that didn't survive contact with reality, one thing never changed. Jake was the person she called after every bad day, every big win, every 2 a.m. thought she couldn't say out loud to anyone else. She told herself that was just what best friends did. She never once let herself ask why it was only ever him, and why, in 11 years, she had never once introduced him to someone as just my friend Jake, without a small, unexplainable catch in her chest when she said it. For 2 of those years, Jake dated a woman named Chloe Reyes. They met at a gallery opening where Jake's photography was being shown for the first time, and Chloe, sharp, ambitious, effortlessly charming at every dinner party, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's name and their kids' names too, seemed at first like exactly the kind of stable, real relationship Jake had been telling himself he wanted, after years of shorter things that never quite took. Elena liked her too at first. They went to dinner as a group more times than Elena could count, and Elena remembers thinking, more than once, that Chloe was one of the more genuinely interesting women Jake had dated, someone who might actually be the one to finally get through to him. But Chloe noticed something the very first time she met Elena, at that same gallery opening. It was the way Jake's whole posture changed when Elena walked in 20 minutes late, apologizing, still in her work clothes. It was the way his eyes found her before he'd even finished his sentence to whoever he'd been talking to. It was the way he checked his phone a little faster when Elena's name lit up the screen. The way his stories always somehow looped back to something Elena had said or done, even when the story had nothing to do with her at all. Chloe never said any of this out loud, not for 2 years, but she knew. She had always known. For a long time, she made peace with it the way people often do, by telling herself it didn't matter, that Elena was just a friend, that whatever she was seeing wasn't real as long as Jake never acted on it. She built an entire 2-year relationship on top of that quiet, managed denial, and for a while, it actually worked. When Jake ended things with Chloe, 7 months before the story's central night, sitting her down gently in the apartment they'd started sharing, he told her it wasn't about anyone else, and in his own mind, that was true. He hadn't cheated. He hadn't even admitted his feelings to Elena, let alone acted on them. He told Chloe he just didn't think he could give her what she deserved, which was, in its own roundabout way, the most honest thing he'd said in the entire relationship. But Chloe didn't believe in technicalities. She believed in what she'd felt in that gallery 2 years earlier, and in the small mountain of evidence she'd quietly collected since. She packed her things over one long, silent weekend, and on her way out the door, made herself a private promise she never said aloud to anyone. If he's never going to be mine, he's never going to be hers either. That promise would sit patiently, almost dormant for 7 more months, until the moment it mattered most. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that gives no warning at all that it's about to become the hinge everything else swings on. Elena had just closed the biggest client deal of her career. 18 months of work, condensed into one signature, and, without thinking twice, without even considering calling anyone else first, she texted the one person she always told first. Jake showed up at her apartment 40 minutes later with a bottle of cheap champagne he'd grabbed at the corner store and the same crooked smile he'd had since he was 9 years old, holding out a birthday present he was too nervous to give her. They sat on her balcony while the city hummed below them, 12 stories down, and somewhere between the second glass and the third, with the sky doing that particular deep blue it does, right before it commits to being night, Elena said something she'd never said out loud before. "Why has nobody ever made me feel the way you do, just by showing up?" She meant it as a joke mostly. Jake didn't laugh. He went very still, the way he'd gone still at 19 with her head on his shoulder, except this time, 14 years of practice at staying silent finally, completely failed him. "Because I've been in love with you since I was 14, he said. "Actually, at prom, in that diner, I almost told you. I've had probably 100 moments exactly like this one, and I let every single one of them go, because I genuinely thought I couldn't survive losing you if you said no. I still think that, honestly. I'm terrified right now, but I'm more tired of not saying it than I am of being scared." The city didn't stop. The rain didn't pause dramatically the way it does in movies. It was, in fact, a perfectly clear night. Elena just sat there, silent, running 11 years of memories backward through her mind all at once. The diner, the popsicles on the porch, the parking lot after Marcus broke up with her, the 4 in the morning phone call the night she called off her wedding. Watching every one of them rearrange themselves into a shape she'd never let herself see clearly before, like a photograph developing in front of her. Then she reached over, took his hand, and said, "You're the only person who's ever actually known me. I think some part of me has been waiting for you to say that for years, and I never let myself admit it, because admitting it felt like it would change something I couldn't afford to lose." For the next 3 weeks, they existed in the kind of quiet, private happiness that people who've known each other for over a decade get to skip straight to. There was no awkward getting-to-know-you phase, no nervous first-date small talk. There was a Sunday spent doing absolutely nothing but reading in the same room, occasionally reading sentences out loud to each other. There was a Wednesday when Jake showed up unannounced with takeout because Elena had mentioned, offhand, 3 days earlier, that she was craving Thai food, and he'd simply remembered. There was a weekend trip up the coast that neither of them planned particularly well, and that turned out to be one of the best 2 days of either of their lives, specifically because of how unplanned it was. There was a Thursday, in that same stretch, when Elena almost told Jake about a strange, uneasy feeling she couldn't fully name yet. Not about the screenshot, which hadn't arrived yet, but a smaller, quieter unease, the kind that shows up before you have a reason for it. They were cooking dinner together in her small kitchen, and she stopped, spatula in hand, and said, "Can I ask you something and have you just answer honestly, no matter what it is?" Jake, chopping vegetables, said of course. And then Elena, unable to find the actual words for what she was feeling, asked instead a smaller, safer version of the question, "Are you sure about this? Really sure? Not just sure because it's easier than starting over with someone new?" Jake put the knife down, walked around the counter, and answered without a single second of hesitation, "I have never been more sure of anything in my entire life. I've had 11 years to think about whether this was real. You've had 3 weeks. I understand if you need more time than that, but don't ever doubt that I'm sure." Elena believed him completely, in that kitchen, in that moment. It would take a fabricated screenshot and a countdown clock at an airport gate to make her doubt it again, and by the time that happened, she would remember this exact conversation, and finally understand which version of the two of them had been telling the truth the whole time. It should have been the ending. In most stories it would have been, but this was only the beginning of the hard part. Word travels fast in a friend group that's shared over a decade of history. Within a week, Chloe knew. A mutual friend mentioned it casually, not realizing what she was handing over. And Chloe did not respond the way an ex who genuinely moved on would respond. She didn't scream. She didn't beg Jake to reconsider. Chloe was smarter and more patient than that. Instead, she reached out to Elena directly. Warm, casual, "It's been way too long, we should catch up. No agenda. Promise." Over that coffee, Chloe planted something small and precise, delivered with just the right amount of reluctant honesty. She mentioned, almost in passing, stirring her latte, that Jake had a pattern, that he fell hard and fast, said all the right things, and then quietly pulled away the moment things got serious. "I just don't want you to get blindsided," she said. "You're one of the only people I actually liked in that group, and I'd hate for you to find out the way I did." It was a lie built almost entirely out of truth, which is what made it so effective. Jake had, in fact, pulled away from serious relationships before, Sarah, Nina, and others, but only because none of those women were Elena. Chloe knew that better than anyone. She used it anyway. Elena left that coffee with a small, cold seed of doubt sitting in her chest, one she told herself she wouldn't let take root. She didn't tell Jake about the conversation, but 2 weeks later, Chloe went further. Late one night, Elena's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, forwarded, supposedly, from a mutual friend who'd stumbled across it. It was a screenshot of a text conversation that looked, at a glance, like it was between Jake and Chloe. Recent, warm, ambiguous, in exactly the way that lets a reader fill in the worst version of the story themselves. In it, Jake wrote something that read like he still missed her, still thought about her, wasn't sure he was ready to be serious with anyone new. Elena stared at it for almost an hour, in the dark, before she convinced herself it had to be fake, manufactured out of someone's jealousy. She was right. Chloe had built it herself over a slow Sunday afternoon, careful with the fonts, careful with the timestamps, careful enough that even Elena's instincts couldn't fully dismiss it. Elena never showed it to Jake. She filed it away in the back of her mind instead, another small brick in a wall she didn't yet realize she was building, brick by brick, around the one relationship she'd never had to defend before. In between the coffee and the screenshot, Elena did something she'd never admit to anyone until much later. She spent one entire night, alone, doing something close to her own quiet investigation. She scrolled back through years of old photos, old group texts, old captions, looking for evidence of a pattern Chloe had planted in her mind, the way you start noticing a word everywhere once someone points it out to you. She found nothing conclusive, because there was nothing conclusive to find, but she found enough ambiguous, ordinary moments. An old photo of Jake and Chloe laughing at a birthday dinner, a comment Chloe had left under an old post of Jake's that read a little too fondly, that her exhausted, doubt-addled mind at 1 a.m. was able to build into something that felt, in the moment, like confirmation. She even, for one embarrassing hour, suspected Jake's own sister of being the one stirring things up, before realizing the timing didn't line up, and the suspicion made no sense at all. That's the thing about doubt. Once it's been given a running start, it doesn't need good evidence. It just needs enough hours alone with a phone and an imagination. A third incident followed within the month. Smaller, but somehow more corrosive than the first two, because it required no fabrication at all. Chloe simply arranged, without seeming to arrange anything, to be at the same coffee shop Jake frequented on Saturday mornings. At the same time, Elena happened to be walking past on her way to a client meeting. Elena saw them through the window, Chloe laughing at something, her hand briefly on Jake's forearm the way old friends touch each other without thinking about it, Jake laughing back, completely unaware Elena was even on that block. It was nothing. It meant nothing. But Elena kept walking and didn't mention it, and the wall in her chest grew one brick taller without either of them ever noticing it was being built. Then, 3 weeks into their relationship, a second obstacle arrived, one that had nothing to do with Chloe at all, and that Elena would later admit was almost harder to process, precisely because there was no villain to blame for it. Jake had applied almost a year earlier for a documentary photography fellowship based in Paris, a once-in-a-career opportunity that would mean a full year abroad, embedded with a small team covering stories across Europe for a major outlet. He'd applied before any of this happened, back when he assumed his life with Elena would stay exactly the way it had always been. Close, warm, and permanently just out of reach. He'd genuinely forgotten about the application, filed it away the way he'd filed away every feeling he'd ever had about her. Then, the same week Chloe's fabricated screenshot landed in Elena's phone, the acceptance email arrived. They needed an answer in 3 weeks. The fellowship started in 1 month. Jake told Elena immediately, sitting on the same balcony where everything had started, the bottle of cheap champagne now just a memory between them. "I don't want to go anywhere without you," he said, "but I don't know how to just turn down the biggest opportunity of my career 3 weeks into this, and I don't want you to think I'm choosing it over you. I genuinely don't know what the right thing to do is, and I hate that I don't know." His mother, when he called her that same night, told him something he didn't want to hear. "You've waited 11 years to have this. Don't let a job be the reason you're scared enough to almost lose it again." Jake didn't answer her right away. He sat with the phone against his ear, saying nothing, until his mother finally added, more gently, "Jake, I watched you love that girl since you were 14 years old. I am not going to sit here and watch you find a new way to run from her." Jake told her he wasn't running. His mother, who had raised him and knew him better than almost anyone alive, simply said, "Then prove it. Don't tell me. Tell her." He hung up the phone and didn't call Elena that night, and would spend the next several weeks wishing he had. On her side of the city that same week, Elena had a conversation of her own, with her mother, over coffee, the same mother who had once called her stubbornness exhausting. Elena hadn't planned to bring up Jake at all, but somewhere between the second cup and the third, it came out anyway. The confession, the fellowship, the strange cold feeling she couldn't name. Her mother listened without interrupting, then said something Elena would turn over in her mind for weeks afterward. "Sweetheart, I watched that boy ride his bike past our house for an entire summer when you were 11 years old, pretending it was a coincidence every single time. I have been waiting over 20 years for you to notice what the rest of us saw before you could talk in full sentences. Whatever's making you doubt this now, I'd think very hard about whether it's actually about him, or about something, or someone else entirely." Elena laughed it off at the time. She would think about that sentence again much later, standing in an airport terminal with 11 minutes left on a boarding clock. Elena, still quietly carrying the weight of a screenshot she'd never mentioned, and the memory of a hand on a forearm through a coffee shop window, heard something else entirely in Jake's uncertainty. She heard a man who, the moment things got real, found a reason to put an ocean between them. Exactly the pattern Chloe had warned her about, arriving right on schedule, exactly as predicted. She told him, gently, that he should take it, that she'd never forgive herself if he didn't, that she wasn't going to be the reason he gave up something this big. She meant it, in that moment, as generosity. Jake heard it as permission to leave, and some small, terrified part of him, the same part that had stayed silent for 11 years, the same part Sarah and Nina had both correctly identified, wondered, in his worst moments, if she was actually relieved. Neither of them said out loud what they were genuinely afraid of, and into that silence, both obstacles kept quietly working against them. Just as the distance between Elena and Jake was widening, Alex Kane resurfaced, and this time, it wasn't just personal. Alex had, in the 2 years since their broken engagement, become a partner at an investment firm that was now in early talks to fund one of Elena's biggest clients, a deal that could double the size of her agency inside a year, the kind of deal she'd built her entire career toward being ready for. He showed up at her office under the guise of a business meeting, professional and composed, and only after the meeting formally ended did he add, almost casually, folding his notes closed, that he'd heard she was happy again, that he'd never stopped regretting how things ended, that he'd changed in ways he hoped she'd eventually see for herself. He left with a handwritten note that said only, "I know now what I lost. I hope it's not too late, for us, or for the deal. Either way, I'd like to be in your life again." The note was, whether Alex intended it that way or not, a quiet kind of pressure. Reject him personally, and there was a real professional risk the deal might quietly complicate itself in ways that were technically deniable and practically undeniable. Elena was too smart not to notice the position she'd been put in, and too honest with herself not to admit that some old, unresolved part of her was curious anyway, especially now, with Jake's departure sitting on the calendar like a countdown she didn't know how to talk about. Elena was not the same woman who had almost married Alex. But she was also confused, hurt by the sudden distance from Jake, unsettled by a screenshot she'd never mentioned to anyone, quietly haunted by an image through a coffee shop window, and facing the possibility of losing the person she loved to another continent in less than a month. For one vulnerable 3-week stretch, she let Alex back into her life, telling herself it was just business, and maybe just an old friendship, the same lie people always tell themselves right before it stops being true. There were 2 dinners. There was one moment, at the second dinner, when Alex reached across the table, and she let him hold her hand for exactly 4 seconds before pulling it back, both of them pretending it hadn't happened. At that same second dinner, Alex mentioned, almost gently, that the investment committee had asked him directly whether Elena's agency was a stable long-term partner, a question that had nothing to do with her business and everything to do with her personal life, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so out loud. Elena drove home that night furious at herself for staying quiet, and furious at a version of the world where a woman's business deal could still, in 2026, quietly hinge on a man's opinion of her love life. And it was that anger, more than anything Alex had actually said, that finally started cutting through the fog Chloe had spent 2 months building. Jake watched this happen from the outside, from a distance that felt entirely his own doing, and it confirmed everything Chloe had planted, even though he never knew Chloe was the one who'd planted it. One evening, walking home a different way than usual, he passed the restaurant where Elena and Alex were having their second dinner, and stood across the street in the rain for almost 10 minutes, watching them through the glass, before making himself keep walking. He didn't fight for her. He did what he always did. He stepped back to protect the friendship, telling himself that if this was what she needed, the least he could do was not make it harder for her by making a scene he had no right to make. Quietly, without telling her, he emailed the fellowship program the next morning and confirmed his full acceptance, the 12-month version. He would leave the country in 9 days. For a moment, it looked like the story might end exactly the way Chloe had hoped, with Jake gone, Elena drifting back toward Alex's orbit, and 11 years of almost quietly folding back into the same silence that had protected and imprisoned it for so long. The morning Jake was set to leave, he packed his apartment slowly, deliberately, the way people pack when part of them is hoping something will interrupt the process. He kept the framed photo from the bonfire, the one his sister had taken decades ago, the one where you could just barely see, if you knew to look for it, 14-year-old Jake watching Elena instead of the fire, and wrapped it carefully in a sweater before placing it in his carry-on, the one bag he refused to check. His sister stopped by to say goodbye and found him sitting on the floor of his half-empty apartment, staring at his phone, Elena's name on the screen, a message typed out and deleted 4 separate times. "Just send it," his sister finally said. He didn't. He told himself there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said, and that saying it again now would only make leaving harder for both of them. He was wrong, but it would take one more phone call to prove it. Then Elena's best friend from college, Priya, called her with something she'd been sitting on for weeks, unsure how to bring it up. Chloe, apparently, had made the same concerned coffee shop speech to at least 2 other people in the friend group over the years, always right after finding out Jake had started something serious with someone. "I should have said something months ago," Priya admitted on the phone, her voice tight with guilt. "I told myself it wasn't my business, that maybe I was reading too much into it, but then I heard he's leaving tonight, and I couldn't sit on this anymore, and just watch you let him go for a reason that might not even be real." And Priya had more than a pattern. Her husband, who worked in digital forensics as a side hobby, had looked at the screenshot Elena had finally, reluctantly shown her in a moment of exhausted honesty, and confirmed what Elena's gut had suspected the entire time. The font kerning didn't match the messaging app Jake actually used. The timestamp format was wrong. It wasn't concern. It had a name and a motive, and now it had proof. Elena confronted Chloe directly that same afternoon, calmly, without raising her voice, laying the fabricated screenshot flat on the table between them, and watched Chloe's practiced warmth crack in real time, layer by layer, until there was nothing performed left underneath it. Chloe finally admitted everything. The coffee, the screenshot, arranging to be seen with Jake at that coffee shop, all of it. She said she had never stopped hoping Jake would come back, and she couldn't stand watching him build, effortlessly, the life with Elena he'd never once tried to build with her, in 2 full years together. She'd built the fake message in 20 minutes on a slow Sunday, telling herself at the time it was just a nudge, not really a lie, the way people always tell themselves that, right up until they're looking at the evidence spread out on a table in front of them, and someone they hurt is looking back at them, waiting for an explanation that doesn't exist. Elena asked her the only question that actually mattered, once the confession was finished, and the anger had briefly quieted into something closer to exhaustion. Did you ever actually think this would work? That if you pushed us apart long enough, he'd come back to you? Chloe was quiet for a long moment, staring at the fabricated screenshot on the table between them like it belonged to someone else. No, she finally said. I don't think I thought that far ahead. I think I just couldn't stand watching him give you, in 3 weeks, everything he never gave me in 2 years. I told myself I was protecting you from getting hurt. I think I was actually just making sure I wasn't the only one who ended up hurt. It wasn't an excuse. Elena didn't accept it as one. But it was, at least, finally honest. The first honest thing Chloe had said to her in 2 months. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was heartbreak that curdled, slowly, into sabotage. And understanding that didn't make it forgivable, but it made everything suddenly, painfully clear. Elena checked the time. It was 4:40 in the afternoon. Jake's flight to Paris left at 7:15 that night. She drove straight from that conversation toward Jake's apartment, hands shaking on the wheel, and then, when a text from his sister confirmed he'd already left for the airport 3 hours early to deal with visa paperwork at the counter, she redirected, cutting across the city in rush-hour traffic that had absolutely no interest in cooperating with her timeline. She called him 4 times. He didn't pick up. His phone was already off, exactly the way the airline tells international passengers to do before departure. Somewhere around the second red light she hit in a row, sitting in traffic that refused to move, Elena's phone rang. It was Alex. She almost didn't answer, then did, mostly out of habit. He'd heard through the same small grapevine that had started this entire mess that Jake was leaving that night, and he asked carefully whether she wanted him to come with her, whether she wanted support, and he said this part quietly, like it cost him something, whether this meant there genuinely wasn't a version of the future that included him after all. Elena, gripping the wheel with one hand, told him the truth as plainly as she could manage while running a countdown clock in her head. I need you to hear this clearly, because I don't have time to say it twice. There was never a version of this where I was choosing between the two of you. I was choosing between being honest and being comfortable, and I picked comfortable for way too long. I'm sorry if that's not the answer you wanted, but I need you to let me go, right now, so I can go be honest. Alex was quiet for a second, then said only, go. Don't let the light change again. It was the kindest thing he'd done in the entire story, and Elena would remember it long after the anger toward him had faded into something closer to gratitude. She wasn't doing this for Alex, and she wasn't doing this out of guilt. For the first time in 3 weeks, she finally understood exactly why she'd been so unsettled the entire time. She hadn't been falling out of love with Jake for a single second. She'd been lied to by someone who couldn't bear watching her fall further into it, at the exact moment the two of them had needed honesty the most, and had somehow, quietly, given each other the least of it. She abandoned her car in a parking structure she didn't have a reservation for, in a spot clearly marked for airline employees only, and ran through a terminal she hadn't set foot in years, past a line for security that looked, from a distance, genuinely hopeless. A TSA agent stopped her before she'd gotten 10 feet past the entrance. No ticket, no boarding pass, no way through. She stood there for a full, agonizing minute, watching the departures board flip Jake's flight status from boarding toward final call, doing the math on how little time was actually left, feeling, for the first time in this entire story, genuinely and completely powerless. So she did the only thing left to do. She called every mutual friend she had, standing in the middle of the terminal with people flowing around her in both directions, until someone, a friend of a friend who happened to work ground operations for the airline, found a gate agent willing to send a message forward, on the theory that in an airport, occasionally, a name and a two-sentence plea can still travel faster than a boarding line. Jake heard his name over the terminal speakers as he stood at the gate with his boarding pass already scanned once for a status check, followed by a message he'd remember for the rest of his life. Jake Sullivan, please return to the security checkpoint if possible before final boarding. Someone is here who says she should have said this 11 years ago. He looked at the gate agent, looked at the plane through the window, and made a decision in about 4 seconds that had taken him 11 years to be ready to make. He walked back through the checkpoint with his boarding pass still folded in his hand and found Elena standing there, out of breath, mascara slightly smudged, absolutely certain for the first time in her adult life about exactly what she wanted and exactly what she was willing to risk to say it. I'm not asking you to give up Paris, she said, still catching her breath. I'm asking you to not disappear the moment things got real, because someone convinced me you would, and I let her. And I am so sorry. I don't want an ocean between us right now. I want to actually find out what this is, together, in the same city, without anyone else's fingerprints on it anymore. Jake looked down at the boarding pass in his hand, then back at her, and something in his face finally, fully relaxed for what looked like the first time in 11 years. I already talked to the program director an hour ago, he said quietly. Before any of this, I asked if there was a version of this where I could take a 6-month placement instead of 12, and start in 3 months instead of 1. Enough time to actually build something real with you before I go, and a plan to come back to, instead of just leaving and hoping it survives. They said yes. I was going to tell you tonight, from the gate, before all of this happened. I wasn't running from you. I made a mistake going quiet, instead of just talking to you honestly, but I was never running. They didn't get a perfect ending wrapped in a bow, and this story never once pretends they did. Chloe was quietly pushed out of the friend group. Some people forgave her eventually, some didn't, and she moved to another city about 8 months later, still working through. In therapy, she finally agreed to start. Exactly why loving someone had made her capable of something she wasn't proud of. Alex, to his credit, backed away with more grace than anyone expected once Elena told him plainly where things stood. The investment deal went through anyway, on its own merits, unaffected, and he sent her a short note a few months later that read simply, I hope you got what I couldn't give you. Good luck. Jake did go to Paris 3 months later, for 6 months instead of 12, and Elena visited twice, and they video called almost every night at inconvenient hours across a 6-hour time difference, and neither of them pretended distance was easy, because it wasn't. But for the first time, they were doing the hard thing together, instead of quietly protecting each other from it. Elena and Jake got something rarer than a perfect ending. They got a real one, built on 11 years of proof, a diner at midnight in prom clothes, one terrifying honest night on a balcony, a fabricated screenshot, a countdown clock at an airport gate, and a decision, made in full daylight with nothing hidden anymore, to actually choose each other on purpose, out loud, where it could be tested. A year and a half later, Jake proposed on that same rooftop where this whole story began. No cameras, no reenactment, just the two of them and a city they'd finally stopped letting anyone else quietly define for them. Elena's mother, at the small engagement dinner that followed, raised a glass and said only, over 20 years, 1 bicycle, and 1 airport terminal. Took you too long enough. And the whole table laughed in the particular way families laugh when a joke is really just relief, wearing a funny hat. Jake's mother, sitting beside her, simply reached over and squeezed Elena's hand, the way you'd welcome someone who had, in every way that mattered, already been family for a very long time. They got married 18 months after the proposal. In a small ceremony neither of them let anyone else plan for them. Jake's toast at the reception was short. He thanked exactly 2 people. His mother, for finally forcing him to stop being a coward, and Elena, for running through an airport for a man who spent 11 years too scared to run toward her first. Elena's toast was shorter still. She simply said, he had cake on his face at my 11th birthday party. That was a lie. But it's the best lie anyone's ever told me, because it's the reason we're standing here 23 years later. The room laughed, and Jake, for possibly the first time in the entire story, didn't need 11 years to find the right words back. He just took her hand, in front of everyone, and didn't let go. Elena spent 11 years assuming the person who knew her best could never be the person meant for her. It took a jealous ex, a fellowship on another continent, a broken engagement's unfinished business, and one sprint through an airport terminal for her to finally understand what had been standing right beside her, patiently, the entire time. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If the person who has always shown up for you, quietly, patiently, without ever once asking for anything back, were finally honest about how they felt, and something threatened to pull you apart the exact moment you both said it out loud, would you have run through that airport? Or would you have let the silence win, the way it almost did for both of them, for 11 long years? And maybe the harder question underneath that one is this: how many Chloes and Alexas pass through all of our lives, not necessarily as villains, but as moments of doubt, distraction, or fear, quietly testing whether we're actually going to fight for the thing that scares us the most, because it matters the most. Elena almost let hers win. Jake almost let his win twice over 11 years. The only reason this story has the ending it has is that, in the final hour, both of them finally stopped being careful. Tell me in the comments, has this ever happened to you or someone you know? And if this story pulled you in, subscribe, because next week, I'm telling you about the woman who found a letter her husband was never supposed to send, 20 years after he wrote it.